Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're covering a topic that I've actually had on my plate for a little while. It just didn't really make the cut for actually making a discussion video about it, in the last handful of months since I thought of it. But recently enough, Bookborn actually ended up covering the topic a little bit, and so I decided it was time to actually do so myself, to say a little bit of my piece, what I had planned to say before. The video in question that Bookborn made, I'll probably link to it up there if I can, and also in the description, is a video titled "The Book Review is Dead," in parentheses, a response. So I will leave, obviously, the links for you to go watch that video down below. It is very good video. Bookborn's content is really good, and she's very thoughtful at producing these kinds of interesting discussions. Certainly a lot more interesting and well-researched and stuff like that than today's video of my own will be, but the discussion is for today in this video is basically regarding the same thing, the role of reviews in society, and particularly amongst, the internet society specifically. This discussion is primarily focused on books because this main channel of mine is about books, but I do think that it also applies broad scale across media. I am doing this video as a collaboration with my second channel because I cover film and gaming and stuff like that on my second channel as well, and I do think the topic is broadly applicable. Without further ado, all of that being said, let's get into my thoughts on the discussion. We'll start off with a it's actually not a simple question at all, but let's talk about what I think traditional critics do. The types of people who review media or review anything really. It could even be food critics. This could probably also apply to, I don't know. But what do critics do? What is proper criticism, quote unquote, as I'm going to refer to that throughout the course of this video? Well, in my opinion, I think that proper criticism does need to include some degree of objectivity and a manner of active feedback in it. There is a degree to which active criticism by proper critics who are more or less trained in the field definitely do these things within their reviews, and that is a big part of what they produce. Generally speaking, I think that a proper critic is basically expected to have some deep knowledge of the medium that they are covering, with some of those things including history, general trends within the medium, specific techniques that are utilized therein, overall just having a unique perspective of what they're covering, not just reviewing the thing that they are reviewing in and of itself, but reviewing it within the context of the entire medium. There is a professional layer to this way of covering things. And as a result of this professional layer, there is a sort of level of inherent framework, I believe, that explains why something works. They use that knowledge, they use that experience to basically give you information as to why something does or does not work, or why something bucking a trend, or why something being unique and standing out ends up working, or why some attempt to do that might not work in another case, right? There's certainly a very heavy level of conversation that a proper critic, quote unquote, will generally utilize to explain what that thing is doing within the context of its medium, usually trying to keep their personal opinion relatively muted within the conversation. Of course, they're able to like or dislike the thing, or just straight up think the thing has no merits but like it anyway, or not like a thing even though they think that it is, in some manner objectively good. It's just not for them, right? There's certainly an objective, like I said, layer, a framework from which they're working from that really influences the conversation pieces that they're producing. There's a degree to which this kind of critique is also aimed directly at the artist in a sense, right? Basically, a proper critic's work is not just to inform an audience of stuff. It is also a way to encourage growth and improvement for the future and for people looking to get into that medium. If I'm reading a book review, or if I'm reading a film review from a proper critic, what I'm looking for in part as part of that piece is learning a little bit about some of the technical elements of that work, the technical reasons why a film does or doesn't work, or the aspects of what it's doing successfully versus what it's kind of failing on in this quote unquote objective sense, and being able to internalize that information like, oh, if I want to make a film myself, what is and isn't applicable to my field based off of the way that this critic and all the other critics just kind of have a consensus of what this looks like, right? Of course, one should not produce art solely for critics or any individual person except for themselves, right? But there is a degree to which that information can be useful and applicable no matter what field you are working in. Certainly, to a degree, artists can treat a proper critic's coverage like a form of writer's group, a means of looking at the consensus across various different critical waves, I guess, mediums, we'll say, even though that's not necessarily the right term. Critical sources might be a better way to put it. Artists can take that measure of feedback in the same way that they might from, like I said, a writer's group. If you were an author and you were with a bunch of other writers and you're exchanging feedback and exchanging your work with other people, you're learning more about your medium in multiple different senses. That's not to say that critics are necessarily artists within their own medium. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not, and sometimes the ones that are good at it, and sometimes they're not. That's a whole different conversation, but you can treat it that way, right? You can take this different feedback and find where some of the consistent bits of information are. What is consistently being dogged on, what is consistently being praised, and you can work with that and your own art to kind of adapt and grow into the future, right? But all that being said, there is also the element of, a proper review also targeting the reader, and the way that a proper critic's work will target the consumer of that review is going to differ based off of medium, of course, but I do think that it has an inherently different relationship with its audience versus something a little bit less formal. So, for example, I think that a proper review will aim to encourage a reader to see things more deeply than they might otherwise see those things. Like I said, just that kind of that inherent knowledge that they have with their field and the experience that they have reviewing those things, they can give recommendations based off of that information to an audience. And, the best critics, in my opinion, also implicitly provide guidelines for readers to view things more deeply. But with that knowledge base, with that ability to kind of poke and prod at very specific things that somebody who's not very well versed in that field might miss or otherwise fly over, they might be able to look at things and be able to appreciate them in different lights, or see things in ways, like I said, that they otherwise might not. And this is something that I think is going to come more specifically from professional reviewers rather than from a less formal context, as I said. But generally speaking, I think the thesis of this point that I'm trying to make is that a critic's coverage is somewhat meant to override their personal opinion. Kind of like I was suggesting before, I think that it is a big deal when a person, and particularly a critic, can like or dislike something that they think is respectively bad or good, right? Somebody doesn't necessarily need to be good at doing that thing themselves to be able to know why something works. Somebody can know every technique an oil painter utilizes instantly, right? Be able to recognize everything that a painter did, but also not be able to paint everything themselves, and based off of the knowledge that they do have, still be able to tell you if a painting is, basically well done technically or not, regardless of whether or not they personally like it. Nobody can 100% deny personal opinion in something that they're covering, whether they think something is good or bad, but I do think that a critic is generally held up to higher standards and is expected to be a little bit different. Proper criticism, as I've been calling it throughout this section, is what true reviewing in the proper sense of the term generally should be. So the other side of this conversation is, what are less formal reviews doing? What are online reviewers, as Bookborn refers to them in her video, what are we doing? Because I'm part of this crowd. I think that there is a very heavy emphasis on online reviewers being, more or less incapable of being held to some of the high standards that critics are, because most of us just don't quite have the knowledge base. Kind of as Bookborn covered in her video, I think that there's a much, much lower bar of, or a much lower barrier to entry for most of us, of course, just being able to turn on a camera and talk into it and put a video on YouTube, just being able to, open TikTok and make a video and post something about what you just read. That's a very low bar of entry compared to traditional criticism, which generally involves a lot of schooling and learning about that field, and then sometimes apprenticeships, being like properly trained by people who have been in the field for a long time already. Like there's a lot of work that goes into being a traditional reviewer for all intents and purposes. But despite the barrier to entry being a little bit different, I also am inclined to agree with Bookborn's take that I think, generally speaking, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's just a much different role that we tend to fill within the field, I guess, in general. That's something that I'll talk a little bit more in the next section, or a little bit more specifically in the next section. But as for what we are doing, us online reviewers, us less formal folk, right? I think that online reviewers are often more geared into a manner of reactionary coverage, as opposed to the type of technical review that traditional criticism is generally going to fall into, right? There may be some objective measurements along the outskirts of what we cover, or some of us may try more or less to be as objective as possible when we are reviewing a work, and try to keep our biases and whatever out of it as much as possible. But generally speaking, the less formal online review crowd is going to be a little bit more loose with regard to the objectivity in their reviews, right? We don't precisely know the history or recognize technique or have an insider perspective in a unique way that a traditional critic might in some cases. Some of us might. Somebody like Philip Chase, for example, who's been teaching and studying English and literature and stuff for a very long time, might have a little bit more insight, and also, being associated with certain authors might provide some of us a little bit more insight into some things than the average person might, but that's not quite the level of professionalism that you might expect from a traditional critic, right? So, most of the time I think that we just have the exact opposite. We are relatively speaking, very clueless as to everything that's going on in the background. And so there's not as much of that framework that I was explaining that critics might be expected to utilize when they're covering something, less framework for us to use to explain why something works. So it becomes a little bit more of a matter of whether or not we liked it, and the reasons we think for the why we liked it, right? Like, oh, I liked this thing because of this reason. And while that is technically all a review needs to be for all useful intents and purposes, right? It isn't quite as deep as the literary critic might be. Thus, I believe our focus is kind of the opposite of what I view proper critique as being. I think that critics, generally speaking, are providing feedback to artists as implicit recommendations to audiences. The main focus of what they're doing is geared towards the artist and the field, the insiders, so to speak, and the audiences just happen to be reading it, so we're going to give them a recommendation. I think that that's a little bit more the focus on balance versus us random yahoos on the internet talking to other random yahoos on the internet, I think that proper critics are primarily conversing with other professionals, whereas we're just people talking to other people. There's a slight different context in which the reviews exist, and I think that inherently tends to make most of the difference between proper criticism and just general online reviewing, right? And as one final point to kind of reflect on what I was saying about the core of my previous point about critics, the purpose of what they're doing, trying to avoid personal opinion, I think that, on the other hand, an online reviewer's coverage is going to be thickly lined with their own personal opinion. I think that our work is, generally speaking, more useful when the audiences understand our specific taste. Once our taste is known in relativity to anybody experiencing our reviews, the audience is then able to decide what is and isn't useful to them from that context. So if somebody happens to watch all of my reviews and knows what I like and what I don't like, and the reasons for that, generally speaking, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything I say, they can have a pretty good idea of what their reaction to a specific book or whatever else might be just because of my coverage of it. You have a few favorite reviewers or something like that, and depending on their general balance of feelings about a specific book can give you a very good idea of whether or not you are going to like it, right? That's a very unique means of being able to recommend something or not that technical literary criticism or anything of the sort, professional criticism, it doesn't necessarily quite have. You know, there's a lot of internal conversation amongst professionals in a critical space, but in this less formal online space, there's a lot more just kind of implicit conversation going on. And like I said, that conversation can just be a little bit more useful to a random person on the internet just looking for something, right? In contrast, a critic's work should be able to stand more or less alone on its own as its own kind of art, whereas online reviewers are kind of just spitballing ideas for why we do or don't like something. But that's going to take us into the next section of this video, which is kind of just a general question of, is it time for a new definition of critic? You know, this is something that Bookborn touched on a little bit in her video, because it seems like the proper critic is sort of dying to some degree, especially with regards to book reviews. I think that that's actually a very unfortunate thing, and I think that the institutional knowledge, the sort of angle that comes from the proper criticism, is something that is very much needed. It's actually pretty sad that this type of review is a little bit less common now. But do I think that that means that critics should just be known as critics, even if they're just doing the online review thing? I would actually say no, because believe it or not, there is a ton of use and beauty that comes from both of these different formats that are more or less entirely separate from one another. I think that a proper review can be enlightening in ways that a general reactionary review on YouTube, just generally speaking, isn't going to be. I also think that there are forms of content on the internet that exist that are inspired from a more traditional critic type of standpoint. I think that things like video essays became so popular on this platform because of this reason. Not that the average video essay person is going to be like a critic or is necessarily of professional critical caliber, but the deeper analysis or the attempt at it is something that hits a little bit different, and that's something that wasn't really on this platform for a long time until a handful of years ago, right? And particularly in the video gaming space, I will note, video essays became a very big thing because people just kind of want that kind of content. They're not getting it from traditional critics as much anymore, it seems like, on the internet. But there is certainly still a place for that kind of content. It does still exist. From my personal angle, I'm a little bit more of a general reviewer, and I do actually think that this kind of thing can be super useful as well for, you know, general recommendation. I don't just say this as a bias because this is the type of thing that I do, but sometimes a person doesn't really care about the technical quality of something, whatever that means, according to a critic. Sometimes you just want some guy whose opinion you trust to tell you what to try or what not to try for whatever reason, right? So there is a very different role that a general online review fills compared to a proper critical review. As I said, it's unfortunate that the general or that the professional critics are more or less a dying breed, and it seems like that's becoming a little bit more of a problem as time goes on. But I do think that both those types of reviews and the online reviews fill very different roles, and so trying to conflate the two or combine the two or, you know, like flip around what terms mean what might be something that would be a little bit short-sighted or silly. I don't know. I think that each of them both serve good purposes in and of themselves, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. All this said, the question of the section, like I said, should criticism in and of itself be redefined because general reviews seem to be more popular or more common, more accessible, all of that kind of stuff? I do think that it can be argued that the term of review has been a little bit co-opted or watered down because of the way that our more reactionary pieces are called reviews, even though they're not the same type of thing that professional critics tend to do when they're reviewing something properly, right? I am sympathetic to this argument, but I do not think that we ought to water down the term for criticism. In other words, I don't believe that the definition of that term should change in the context of the internet and the changing priorities of reviews on the internet. Part of the reason for this actually takes us into the actual topic of today's video title. Do I consider myself a critic? I don't think that the usage of critic when you're applying it to people or reviewers online should be watered down. The simple answer to this question, do I consider myself a critic, is no, I do not consider myself a critic. I simply do not have the expertise or the knowledge base to justify claiming myself to be a critic. Furthermore, so far as this video itself is concerned, I don't even really try to be a critic on YouTube. But I bring this topic up in this context because I have had people tell me, I've had people say in my comments that I overrate myself as a critic for disliking certain books, for example. The problem is, I never really claimed myself to be a critic, and I don't necessarily intend to, and I don't think that other general online reviewers should either, because we're not doing the same thing that critics are doing. We have our own role that we fill, as I've tried to explain in my view throughout the course of this video, but I don't think we're critics. I've had comments, like I said, tell me that I overrate myself as a critic, but I've also had comments telling me that I deserve more attention as a critic, like I've had people accuse me of it in a negative sense and praise me for it in a positive sense, both sides. And I think that the veracity of either comment is a little bit debatable. And I do not claim myself to be a critic. I'm basically just a dude on the internet talking about what I like about things, basically. I think I do that thing well enough for certainly some people in my audience, but I'm not being a proper critic. All of that being said, I have thought about this topic quite a bit ever since I came up with the questions like, do I consider myself a critic? That'd be an interesting video topic, right? So I've been thinking about this for several months. And over those months, I have kind of wondered, do I actually consider myself a critic? I just said earlier that the simple answer is no, I don't. But at the same time, I have actually recently started calling myself an amateur critic. Basically my bio on most social media platforms and stuff like that at this point, what the last statement in my bio is amateur critic or something like that. I don't remember what the actual wording is, but it's something like that. And the reason why I have started to use this term is because of the specific context in which I cover certain things, right? So on YouTube itself, again, like I said earlier, no, I'm not trying to be a critic on YouTube, and I'm not one. I just simply am not. I have spoiler-free coverage. I'm generally not going into big specifics whenever I'm reviewing a book, and though I do try to, balance my videos and my thoughts as best as I can, it's not really the degree to which I think might be a little bit more fitting for a critical review. For example, I do sometimes include points that I disagree with for consideration, right? I've included, whenever I review a book, I have a good, the bad, and the ugly section, right? And sometimes, like in the bad, for example, this is where this most frequently happens, I will include something that I don't necessarily think is bad about the book, but something that I think might bother notable amount of other people for one reason or another. And so this is like my attempt at trying to be a little bit more objective, like recognizing something that's like, hey, this is something that's going to bother a lot of people. So if this is something that you really hate in books, it might not be for you, right? Even if it didn't bother me. That's my attempt at being a little bit more objective. And there are other times, on the other hand, where I know my opinion is strong, and so I try to make myself as clear as possible. And sometimes I fail. I have reviewed a book recently this year where I just straight up could not explain why I liked that thing so much or why I think it worked so well. I have like reasons in my head for it, but like actually spitting those ideas out and explaining those things is something that I found very, very difficult to do. And in that sense, some of my reviews could not be considered critical think pieces in any way, shape, or form, not even by the furthest stretch imaginable, because they're just not really providing any insight. Certainly not the way that you might expect a critic to do so, if that makes any sense. So with regards to my YouTube content, I think that my critical qualities do not really emerge in my video content on the whole. Why do I consider myself an amateur critic as of recently? Why have I started putting that in my bio? That is actually because of my more written review content, stuff that I do on platforms like Goodreads in the context of books, but also on Backlogged and Letterboxd as well. These are the platforms where I believe a somewhat more critical flair comes through a little bit. If you remember from the last portion of this video where I discussed like video essays, basically, yeah, I actually do write lengthy and, generally speaking, or hopefully anyway, fingers crossed, pretty coherent and lengthy reviews sometimes for whatever thing that I'm talking about. On the second channel specifically, I do this for movies and video games quite a bit, and those video reviews tend to be using those long written reviews. So I'm a little bit more of a critic on my second channel than on my main channel, I guess I should say. But you know, I am somebody who does technically review books, for example, more than once. I review them once on YouTube in the video context, and then I have the written review that gets posted over onto Goodreads. And I do these for explicitly different purposes. I'm doing explicitly different things with each of those reviews. On Goodreads, those reviews allow me to be a little bit deeper, a little bit more analytical. And even though I still generally try for spoiler-free reaction style reviews over there, somewhat similar to my YouTube reviews, I'm not being like a professional critic on Goodreads all of a sudden. I do think that that does come through over there a little bit. So I guess I do consider myself an amateur critic because of my written reviews, but video reviews, I would say no, I am not. The point is, I guess at the end of this video, is that it's a little bit complicated. You know, I have deep respect and love for real, proper, traditional criticism because I love looking at things like technicality in various different forms. I think that cinema in particular, for example, I love being able to view from the objective critical standpoint. Whenever I do watch a movie, I'm looking at it from the technical aspects just as much as I am from an enjoyment aspect, because that's something that I've always found super fascinating. You know, there's a huge amount of love that I have for the background and the specific type of perspective that traditional critics can provide. In conclusion, basically, I do think that it would be a little bit unfair for the vast majority of online reviewers to call themselves critics, but maybe I'm getting a little bit of a fat head, you know, calling myself an amateur one at this point now. I don't know. But I would be curious to hear some other people's thoughts. Reminder, at the end of this video, if you have not checked out Bookborn's video already, to go watch her video on this topic, because it is very good. It is super quality. She's a little bit closer to a proper critic than I am on YouTube, for what it's worth, and mostly because her videos do incorporate more research, more of an objective perspective, and a much better outlined video structure, generally speaking. I just kind of tend to speak into a camera and see what happens. I don't think this video is very good, for example, but in either case, this was an enjoyable topic. Like I said, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, but for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever it may be.